Jackson Hale had spent the last 20 years living on his family land in acres of woods, orchards, and quiet isolation just outside a growing suburb. He wasn't a recluse, but he preferred the company of birds and trees over nosy neighbors. His land had been in his family for 3 generations, and everything on it from the handmade barn to the spring-fed well was built with care. So when he saw the orange surveyor, flags fluttering in the wind one morning, his heart dropped. At first he thought maybe it was a mistake. He hadn't sold anything, hadn't signed anything. But as he walked the southern fence line, the flags were everywhere, spaced and straight. Deliberate rows stretching toward the wooded ridge. He called the county planning office. No one picked up. He left voicemails. 2 days passed. On the 3rd day, the heavy machinery arrived. Bulldozers, backhoes, and men in bright vests, who didn't bother to knock before tearing through the fence with a forklift and clearing a 50-foot path through his orchard. Jackson rushed out, waving his arms, shouting over the roar of diesel engines. One of the contractors finally cut the engine and climbed down. He was polite enough but firm. "We're with Ridgewood Infrastructure. We've got clearance to run a utility pipeline here through my orchard." Jackson snapped. The contractor pulled a paper from his clipboard. "It's all authorized by the Ridgewood Hills HOA. You're part of their development zone." Jackson stared at him. "I'm not in an HOA." The man shrugged. "Well, someone signed off." By sundown, half the orchard was gone. Trees reduced, 2 splinters. Jackson stood in silence, fists clenched at his sides. That night, he pulled out his deed. The land had never been zoned residential. It had never belonged to a subdivision. There were no shared roads, no voting boards, no agreements. It was sovereign land. His land. He marched into the Ridgewood Hills HOA office the next morning, holding his papers like a shield. The receptionist gave him a tight smile and asked him to wait. Then came Mr. Cole, tall, smug, too well-groomed for someone in charge of trash schedules and mailbox standards. He greeted Jackson like an old friend. "Mr. Hale, I was hoping we'd speak soon. The pipeline project is a vital improvement for the community." Jackson slammed the deed on the desk. "Your community doesn't include me. This is my land. You have no right." Cole didn't even blink. "Our maps say otherwise. You're within the Ridgewood overlay. That land was absorbed into the HOA charter 2 years ago." Jackson's jaw dropped. "That's impossible." Cole smiled. "If you'd like to contest it, I suggest you speak with our legal team." That night, Jackson stood outside in the ruined orchard, staring at the jagged gash in the earth. The machines had already laid the groundwork for what would be a high water line, one that would cut across his groundwater supply and run right under his wellhead. He looked down and noticed something else: deep tracks, tire ruts, and a broken PVC cap. It wasn't just planning. They were already drilling. His eyes narrowed. They'd trespassed. They'd forged documents. They'd dug through his land like he was invisible, but he wasn't going to stay silent. Not anymore. Jackson barely slept that night. He stayed up studying his land deed, satellite maps, and county zoning documents until his eyes blurred. None of it made sense. He was outside the HOA boundary, and always had been. But someone, somewhere, had changed the paperwork. And they hadn't expected him to notice. The next morning, he drove straight to the county recorder's office. He waited 2 hours before a clerk finally called his name. When he handed over the property parcel number, the clerk raised an eyebrow and clicked away at her computer. Then her expression changed. "This parcel's flagged for utility overlay access," she said carefully. "Part of the Ridgewood Hills development." "No, it's not," Jackson said, voice rising. "Can I see the change file?" She hesitated. "Technically, it's public record." "One moment." A few minutes later, she returned with a manila folder. Inside were zoning adjustment forms filed 18 months ago. The signatures were there. A digital stamp. A county official's initials. And at the bottom, a blurry scrawl that was supposed to be his own name. Jackson held it up and laughed bitterly. "This isn't even my handwriting. They forged this." The clerk's face paled. "You might want to speak to the zoning board, but they only meet the first Tuesday of each month." That was 2 weeks away. Jackson took photos of everything in the file, then headed home. Along the way, he passed another Ridgewood construction site, a new row of duplexes being prepped for sewer lines. It hit him then. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a coordinated land grab. His land was just one puzzle piece in a bigger, greed-fueled plan. When he got back, the machines were gone but the damage was done. The trench cut deep across the soil, dangerously close to his underground water system. His well, the one his grandfather hand-dug back in 1974, was at risk. Jackson climbed down into the trench and examined the freshly laid pipe. The labels read municipal mainline. Not HOA, not private. They'd connected his land to the city's water grid through a deal he never agreed to. That night, Jackson set up trail cameras around the trench. He used motion sensors, infrared, even a drone he'd been building for years but never flown. If they came back, he'd have proof. By morning, he had footage, for workers in unmarked trucks, digging again just past midnight. He took the footage to the sheriff. The deputy on duty gave him a blank look. "This sounds like a civil matter. You'll need a lawyer. I have footage of trespassing and property damage. Still civil. If you file a lawsuit, maybe we can do something after the fact." Jackson left the station more frustrated than before. They'd thought this through. Covered their tracks, bought the right signatures, pressured the right officials. Now they thought they could bury him under paperwork. But they forgot one thing. Jackson knew every inch of that land. And if they were going to play dirty, so would he. He pulled out an old blueprint from the Barna-buried irrigation line from the 90s that ran parallel to the new pipe. It hadn't been used in years, but it still connected to the old well. He smiled. Let them dig. Let them build. They had no idea he still had control beneath their feet. For the next few days, Jackson kept quiet. He didn't call the HOA, didn't yell at contractors, didn't even post on social media. Instead, he got to work. He opened the old barn and uncovered a steel lockbox buried beneath a stack of cracked cedar planks. Inside were dusty maps, pipe gauges, and a rusty old valve key. His grandfather had kept meticulous notes on the underground irrigation system. Most people thought it was abandoned. Even Jackson had forgotten about it until now. The old line ran 50 yards under the western slope of the orchard, curved around the edge of the property, and connected directly to the well, but more importantly, intersected with the path the new Ridgewood pipeline now occupied. It was no coincidence. His grandfather had chosen that route because it followed the land's natural gradient. It was the most efficient way to direct water. Jackson realized what that meant. The new pipeline was laid right on top of the old one, and that gave him an idea. At midnight, with no lights and only a headlamp, Jackson dug out the sealed end of the irrigation pipe. It hadn't seen water in decades, but the metal was still solid. He fitted it with a diverter and valve wand that could be operated manually. Then he rerouted a section, placing a spliced connection just beneath where the HOA's pipeline crossed. Overhead, when he turned the valve, he wasn't sure what to expect. At first, there was only silence, then gurgling, pressure, and then a slow, steady flow of groundwater flooding into the space under the HOA's pipeline trench. It wouldn't damage anything immediately, but erosion was a patient destroyer. Jackson installed a pressure monitor and waited. 3 days later, he overheard it. The HOA work crew arguing in the distance. "Something's wrong with the slope." "Yeah, the pipe's starting to dip. It's not holding pressure like before." Jackson smiled to himself from behind the tree line. But he wasn't done. He launched his drone the next night, hovering just over the trench. The footage showed the ground beginning to soften. Minor shifts. One worker tripped in a sinkhole that hadn't been there 2 days earlier. The next morning, Jackson printed stills and mailed them anonymously to the HOA office and the city utility department, along with a typed note: "Undocumented pipeline interference and unpermitted erosion detected. Possible code violations. Recommend immediate inspection." 2 days later, the Ridgewood project came to a full halt. Trucks were pulled. Surveyors were brought in. Word started spreading among Ridgewood residents something about faulty construction. The HOA didn't make any public statements, but Jackson could feel the panic building. That same day, a black SUV pulled up to his gate. Out stepped Mr. Cole. He didn't look smug this time. His eyes scanned the property with cautious calculation before he called out, "Mr. Hale, I'd like to speak civilly." Jackson didn't respond. He simply stood on his porch with a coffee in hand, silent, unmoving. Cole shifted uncomfortably. "We're looking into the pipeline issue. There's been some unexpected complications. I was hoping we could clear the air." Jackson gave a small nod. "Sure," but he didn't move an inch. Cole took the hint, turned back, and drove off. The message was clear. Jackson knew, and Cole didn't like not knowing what else Jackson might have done. That night, Jackson sat at his kitchen table, poring over emails he'd received from a public records request. Among them, one caught his eye. An internal HOA memo between Cole and a local contractor. A single line, "Don't worry, he won't be a problem. His kind never fights back." Jackson chuckled. They had no idea what kind of problem he could become. The Ridgewood Hills HOA called it a temporary construction delay. They released a bland memo to residents, claiming the pipeline project had encountered soil instability and required additional structural analysis. But Jackson knew the truth. His sabotage was working. He spent the next few days tightening the vise. His trail cameras had captured 3 different crews inspecting the erosion site. 2 returned with ground-penetrating radar. They marked the area and left without digging deeper. Literally or figuratively, Jackson smirked. They were afraid to touch anything. But he wasn't. That night, he activated the next phase. Using a custom-built release valve and siphon, he diverted additional water from his well into the trench's lowest point. It wasn't enough to flood anything outright, but over time, it would slowly create microcollapses under the pipe, destabilizing the foundation further. He didn't want a catastrophe. He wanted a slow, irreversible failure, one that couldn't be traced back to him the next morning. He saw the results. 2 Ridgewood board members stood on the edge of the trench, visibly agitated. One pointed toward Jackson's side of the property, the other pulled out a phone. Jackson stayed calm. He had done nothing illegal. Nothing visible. But he also wasn't going to wait for them to catch up. He drove into town and stopped by the local news station. He wasn't there for an interview. He left an envelope, anonymous, untraceable, with a flash drive inside. The footage on the drive showed HOA workers trespassing onto his property. The forged parcel map, showing his land under HOA, arguing about erosion from nowhere, and drone footage of construction continuing without proper soil reinforcement. He didn't include his name. He didn't have to buy the next afternoon. It hit the local headlines. Homeowner's land caught in HOA pipeline scandal. Zoning forgery alleged. The article didn't name Jackson, but the images were clear. Comment sections exploded. Ridgewood residents began demanding answers. The HOA issued a second memo, this one defensive, bordering on hostile. Jackson watched the chaos unfold from the comfort of his porch. But the fight wasn't over. He received an envelope in his mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Just a typed message. "Stop interfering, or legal action will follow. You've been warned." He stared at the letter for a long time. Then he burned it. Jackson had one final move for no end. It was the most dangerous. Late that night, he returned to the access port of the pipeline, hidden behind a line of bushes. He removed the rusted lock the contractors had carelessly installed and slipped inside, using a telescoping rod and pressure gauge. He inserted a custom-sealed bladder and inflatable obstruction, designed to stop the flow without damaging the pipe. Once positioned, he turned the valve. The bladder expanded slowly, pressing against the pipe walls. Jackson watched the pressure gauge drop. From his calculations, it would take 48 hours before the blockage triggered a system-wide alert. That gave him time to watch what happened next. 2 days later, Ridgewood water systems began reporting loss of flow. Residents complained about low pressure, strange smells, and even brown water. Contractors returned. The trench was now flooded halfway with murky water. Someone panicked and called the Environmental Protection Board. Jackson listened to it all unfold over a police scanner. And then finally he got a knock on the door. A man in a suit, another in uniform. "Mr. Hale," the suited man said, "we'd like to ask you some questions about recent disruptions." Jackson didn't blink. "Disruptions?" "Yes. The HOA believes you may be responsible for interfering with a public utility." Jackson opened his door wider and pointed at the surveillance cameras above his porch. "I've been right here, and I have 3 weeks of footage to prove it." They hesitated. And that's when Jackson knew he had them cornered. Jackson didn't flinch as the 2 men stood awkwardly at his porch. "I'm not answering anything without my attorney," he said calmly. "Unless you have a warrant or proof of a crime, this conversation is over." The man in the suit shifted, but said nothing. The uniformed officer nodded, quietly respecting the line in the sand. Moments later, their SUV pulled away in silence, leaving a cloud of dust behind. Jackson watched them go with a steely stare. The pressure was working, but so was the panic. Later that afternoon, the local news picked up the story again. This time, it wasn't just a zoning error or a pipeline disruption. A new whistleblower had come forward. Her name was Sheila Marksa, former Ridgewood HOA board member, who had resigned 6 months earlier under what she had called unethical pressure. Now she was going public. In the news segment, she detailed secret meetings, forged signatures, and collusion between the HOA president, Mr. Cole, and a regional infrastructure company. Her voice trembled as she revealed how they had intentionally redrawn boundary maps to seize land including Jackson's for a pipeline deal worth nearly $2 million in kickbacks. Jackson Hale's property was never meant to be included, Sheila said, but Cole needed access to the aquifer line. Hale's land was the only one that could connect both ends of the system without paying for easement rights. The clip went viral. Ridgewood residents flooded HOA emails and voicemails. Many demanded resignations. Some filed small claims for rising water bills and contaminated tap lines. The HOA scrambled to contain the fallout. Meanwhile, Jackson's mailbox overflowed with letters, some from reporters, others from attorneys offering pro bono help. And buried among them was a thin white envelope marked summons. The HOA had filed suit. Tampering with municipal infrastructure. Criminal sabotage. Property damage exceeding $250,000. Jackson read it slowly, then calmly set it down on his kitchen table. He'd expected it. He opened his laptop and pulled up the high-resolution drone footage. It showed contractors trespassing before permits were issued, night crews working without safety protocols, the pipe being laid directly over an unstable trench. Then he attached the forged HOA zoning map alongside his original land deed, and finally, he compiled emails Sheila had sent him, correspondence from inside the HOA, including a particularly damning one from Mr. Cole. No need to worry. Jackson's off-grid and old school. He won't cause a problem. Jackson grinned. He submitted the full package to the county court as a countersuit: trespassing, forgery, illegal land acquisition, environmental damage, emotional distress. He asked for $1.5 million in damages. A week later, the courthouse set a hearing. Meanwhile, Sheila continued speaking out. She joined podcasts, HOA exposes, even national radio. Every time she mentioned Jackson's name, the public support grew. Protesters gathered outside Ridgewood, HOA's main office with signs like "Hands Off Hale" and "Justice for the Orchard." Local news drones caught footage of board members sneaking out side doors, and then Mr. Cole disappeared. According to rumors, he'd skipped town. His house sat dark and empty. His phone disconnected. But Jackson wasn't done. Not yet, because the court hearing wasn't the final blow. He had one more card to play, something no one knew he still had. The original pipeline. Schematic marked with illegal access points and unpermitted valves buried in his barn under his grandfather's war chest. The kind of document that could bring down more than just the HOA. It could take down the entire development company. 3 days before the court hearing, Jackson received an unmarked flash drive delivered in a plain envelope. No note, no return address. Just the device. He scanned it with an isolated laptop, cautious of viruses. What he found made his jaw tighten. Inside were over 30 PDFs, internal Ridgewood Hills HOA memos, signed agreements with the utility firm, emails from Mr. Cole's private address, and worst of all, video recordings from a Zoom meeting that should have never been saved. Jackson clicked on the most recent file. There was Mr. Cole on camera, in a conference call with 2 city officials and the CEO of the regional infrastructure contractor. "I don't care how you do it," Cole said. "Hale's land is the key. The deed's a technicality. Once we get the pressure line connected, he can sue us all he wants. We'll drown him in court costs." Another voice replied, "We still don't have proper permitting." "Then fake it," Cole snapped. "Just make sure that pipe is live by the end of next quarter. Our investors are getting anxious." Jackson leaned back in his chair. This wasn't just greed. It was premeditated corruption. They'd built their entire plan on one assumption: that he would fold. But someone inside their ranks had turned. He called Sheila. "I didn't send that," she said after he described the flash drive. "But I think I know who did." She told him about a quiet, low-level compliance officer named Vince who had always kept to himself. Vince had worked under Cole for years, hated the shady deals, and had once even tried to resign, but was threatened with a non-disclosure lawsuit. "He knew too much," Sheila explained. "But he's not the kind of guy to go down with the ship." That night, Jackson parked near the Ridgewood Hills clubhouse and waited. At 10:12 p.m., a lone figure emerged from the side door, glancing both ways before hurrying to his car. Jackson approached slowly. "You, Vince?" The man froze. "Who's asking?" "Name's Hale." Vince's shoulders slumped. "You got the drive." "Why help me?" "Because they think they own everything. Vince said quietly. Even people. They don't, and I couldn't live with it anymore. Jackson nodded. You did the right thing. It's not just me they're trying to bury. Vince handed him another envelope. Inside were printed schematics, updated plans showing the illegal pressure lines extended far beyond Jackson's property. They had already broken state water regulations and drilled under multiple homes without permits. This is what takes them down. Vince whispered. Jackson knew he was right. He called his attorney the next morning and added the documents to his countersuit. Then he sent anonymous copies to the state environmental agency, the district attorney, and the county ethics board. The day of the court hearing arrived. Jackson entered the courthouse dressed in jeans and a flannel, exactly as he'd lived every day. Across the aisle sat a new HOA lawyer, young and nervous, flipping through folders. Mr. Cole was nowhere to be found. The judge glanced at the paperwork, tapped her gavel, and said, given the evidence submitted, particularly the submitted video, and permitting violations, this case is proceeding under expanded civil investigation. Mr. Hale, your countersuit will be heard in full. The HOA lawyer's face drained of color, and then, as if on cue, news broke in real time. A state audit had been launched into Ridgewood Hills HOA. The infrastructure company's CEO had resigned, and the mayor's office issued a press release, vowing a full investigation into zoning fraud. Jackson said nothing. He didn't need to, because the empire that stole his land was collapsing, one file at a time. The courthouse parking lot was buzzing with reporters, drones, and Ridgewood residents holding handmade signs. Jackson stepped out of his truck slowly, adjusting the old cowboy hat his grandfather once wore, the same one he used while laying pipe across the orchard decades ago. Now, the same ground those pipes ran under was the foundation of the HOA's biggest mistake. News crews swarmed him. Mr. Hale, any comments about today's hearing? Is it true the Ridgewood HOA may be dissolved by court order? Did you sabotage the pipeline? Jackson said nothing. He walked past the cameras like a man headed to a funeral. There's dot inside. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Sheila sat behind Jackson, flanked by 3 former Ridgewood board members who had all resigned in the past 2 weeks. Vince was there too, hunched low, his hoodie pulled tight. His expression haunted. The HOA's new attorney looked pale and rattled. No, Mr. Cole. No defense witnesses. Just empty chairs, the judge began. For the record, this hearing has been expanded to include additional charges related to zoning fraud, environmental negligence, trespassing, and infrastructure tampering. Mr. Hale, you may proceed with your petition. Jackson's lawyer handed over a bound packet of documents, including the final piece, the original grandfathered easement records showing that Jackson's land had never been under HOA jurisdiction, and at the back an affidavit from a retired city surveyor who admitted, under oath, that he had been pressured into backdating the zoning overlays to favor Ridgewood Hills. The judge reviewed everything. Her eyes narrowed. Then, she looked up. Due to the overwhelming evidence of fraud and misconduct, I am issuing a cease and desist order on all Ridgewood infrastructure projects currently under construction. A collective gasp rippled through the room. She wasn't finished. Furthermore, the HOA's zoning authority is hereby suspended, pending full investigation. Mr. Hale's countersuit for damages will be heard in civil court in 30 days. Jackson didn't smile. He didn't need to. The silence from the Ridgewood side of the courtroom said everything. By evening, the HOA's website was down, their social pages locked. A breaking news segment aired statewide. Landowner exposes multi-million-dollar HOA pipeline fraud. CEO. Officials under investigation. The infrastructure company's stock plummeted overnight. Homeowners in Ridgewood Hills filed a class action lawsuit. And Jackson. He made his way back home, stopping by the trench one last time. The once pristine dig site was now a muddy scar, abandoned and eroding. The bladder he'd installed still sat inside the pipe, cutting off all flow sight. Effective, untraceable, but now, it wasn't revenge. It was a message. He climbed down into the trench and turned the final valve on his own irrigation line, the old one. The one built with honesty and sweat, not greed. Water flowed, not into their pipe, but back to his orchard. His land. The next day Ridgewood HOA was served with a formal motion to dissolve. Cole's assets were frozen. Warrants issued. The pipeline permit was revoked. Jackson received a letter from the county. His land, once fraudulently zoned, had been reinstated as sovereign property completely outside Ridgewood's reach. Neighbors began stopping by to shake his hand. One brought a pie. Another offered help fixing the broken fence. They all said the same thing. You did what none of us could. And Jackson, he just looked out over his field, where new green shoots had started rising again. Not one pipeline in sight. The HOA was dead. Within a month, Ridgewood Hills dissolved entirely. Board members resigned en masse, properties devalued overnight, and residents scrambled to set up emergency neighborhood associations. With the infrastructure company under state investigation, their contracts were voided and all construction halted permanently. But Jackson Hale wasn't celebrating, he was planning. Because while the world watched the HOA burn, Jackson had kept one eye on Mr. Cole. The disgraced president had vanished in the middle of the chaos. Rumors swirled he'd skipped town, changed his name, or fled the country. But Jackson knew better. He'd traced Cole's shell company to a private property, holding in the next county, a small cul-de-sac of upscale homes, including one that had just gone up for foreclosure, owned by none other than Derek Cole. The house was massive 5,000 square feet of arrogance with an oversized glass porch, a fountain shaped like an eagle, and a pool that hadn't seen water. In weeks. Jackson attended the foreclosure auction in person. No cameras, no press. Just a few quiet bidders. He brought a cashier's check. It only took 10 minutes. When the gavel dropped, the deed was his. He bought Cole's house. The same man who had forged Jackson's signature, carved up his orchard, and tried to silence him in court, now had his front door legally owned by the man he tried to destroy. Jackson didn't move in. Instead, he donated the property to a wildlife rehabilitation group that had lost funding after the pipeline project cut through their own rescue trails. Within weeks, the house was transformed into a nature education center. Kids from local schools came for field trips. Injured animals were treated in what used to be Cole's personal gym, his wine cellar, now a bat sanctuary. Jackson visited once just to drop off some tools. As he walked through the foyer, he paused beside the fireplace mantel, where Cole's initials were still carved into the stone. He smiled. Outside, volunteers were planting wildflowers in the backyard. The final blow wasn't a lawsuit or an exposed scandal. It was this, turning Cole's monument to power into a place of healing. As the season turned to fall, Jackson returned to his land. The orchard, while still scarred, had started to recover. Saplings replaced stumps. Birds returned, and the now by any foreign pipe ran, clear as ever. One afternoon, Sheila stopped by with Vince. "There's a settlement coming," she said. "You'll probably get every penny you asked for and then some." Jackson nodded. "It's not about the money." Vince looked out over the trees. "I still can't believe they got away with it for so long." "They didn't," Jackson said, his voice low and certain. "They just thought no one would fight back. They stood together for a while in the quiet. No machines, no shouting, no politics. Just wind through the trees and the creak of old wooden fences by the time the court finalized the judgment." Jackson's countersuit had grown into a class action trigger. Over 60 Ridgewood residents joined. The total payout stretched into the millions. But Jackson didn't go on vacation. He didn't buy a new truck. He used the money to start a legal defense fund for landowners facing unfair HOA tactics across the state. He called it the Boundary Line Project. Because boundaries mattered, and some lines you don't cross.